Yeah, we're back again talking about Trails in the Sky a second time because just recently a brand new remake called Trails in the Sky First Chapter, or Soda no Kiseki the First, just recently released a couple of days ago. And yeah, I literally went out and marathoned this game and 100% this game for reasons that I'll talk about in the comments down below if you ask why. But still, regardless though, this remake was kind of known back in 2023 where Toshihiro Kondo entertained the idea of going back to the Sky games. And later in an August Nintendo Direct Partner Showcase, they officially unveiled the game as Trails in the Sky the First. Though that name was only kept in Japan as Falcom entertained the idea of self-publishing this game in the West, but ultimately they decided to shop this game around to different publishers and ultimately found one was Gunko. And one thing I'll mention right now, Gunko has no involvement with the Trails series up until now, as typically it's either XC Games or NAS America. Though I assume because this game needed a brand new translation because of new mechanics here and there, they couldn't really rely on XC to help translate, and seeing how NAS is very busy with other projects, especially Trails on top of that, I guess it made sense for a different publisher to come in to take over. And towards the release of this game, Toshihiro Kondo explained why this game was going to be remade, as, of course, with brand new games in the Trails series and these games interconnecting story-wise, it becomes much harder for brand new players to get into the series. Sure, some games kind of start a brand new arc in the series with brand new characters and the such, but at the same time, events that happened in the previous Trails games do occur and affect things in later Trails games as well. And most people do recommend starting off with the Sky games. Obviously, there's this whole debate of whether or not you could start at a later game. I don't want to get into that in today's video, because regardless of that, now we have the first game being remade, and people now have access to that first chapter in the book. Pun very much intended. And of course the question is this a good starting point for brand new people who've never played the Trails games before? Well, let's start off with the plot right here, and because I've already gone over the plot in my original Trails review, which check that video out, card on top, I'll be going in a more abridged version of the story, just so we don't spend too much time this time around, but at the same time I am going to make some corrections here and there or elaborate on some things that I missed out in my original story synopsis. So once again, let's go over the plot, and if you do not want to be spoiled, get to this portion right here. So the story here follows a young girl known as Estelle Bright, daughter of the famed bracer Cassius Bright, and one day he brings in a young boy known as Joshua and takes him in as his own. So Estelle now has a half-brother. And on their 16th birthday, both Estelle and Joshua work together to become junior bracers. And upon becoming junior bracers, Cassius has to go over to Erebonian to investigate something, while Estelle and Joshua take over the task that Cassius was originally meant to do. Though one thing leads to another was the Copwell family, a missing airliner to where Cassius was assumed to be a part of, and ultimately leads to Estelle and Joshua going on a journey throughout the land of Libero to become senior bracers. And then there's a whole military coup, and also a mad scientist known as Professor Weissman pretending to be a side character at the end of the game, basically telling Joshua, "You did everything for me, my plan is just beginning." And that's the abridged version right there. But at the same time, I did mention I do want to make some corrections that I forgot to either mention or didn't elaborate as much in the original Trails in the Sky story synopsis. Starting first off with the Black Orbnet. Estelle and Joshua did get the Black Orbnet, but they also received a letter referring to a K and Professor Ard, and this is how they meet up with Professor Russell, and eventually down the line they find out K stands for Kurt, and Kurt is going through all the weird memory manipulation by Professor Weissman. And secondly, regarding Agate, as I mentioned in the Scythe story portion, Agate pops out of nowhere when in actuality, he was actually chasing down the masked people that were working with Gilbert and the Mayor of Ruan, all the way down to Scythe, which is why he's there. And then there's Zen. As I mentioned before, I didn't really know how to properly introduce him until the martial arts tournament, but part of the reason why he's in Libero is because of Cassius, as Cassius sent a letter to Zen to head over to Libero and look over his kids. And then we have Richard and the whole coup against the Libero government, as he was actually becoming much more successful by taking over the Libero military, suppressing people who questioned his authority, people like Yulia or General Morgan. And once he kidnapped the princess, his plan was to instill a fake king, we'll say, with Duke Dunan, who was introduced in Chapter 2. He's pretty much a self-entitled asshole, we'll say, thinks highly of himself, of course, as a noble, which is of course perfect for Richard, to where Duke Dunan will have the public appearance while Richard strings along people like puppets on strings. And finally, Joshua's backstory, to where when Joshua finishes that backstory, he tells Estelle he plans to leave, but Estelle tells Joshua he's running away from his problems, and they're willing to work together to help him face whatever he's dealing with. Which of course leads to Joshua sedating Estelle. And yeah, that's all the corrections I needed to make. This is what happens when you don't prepare and write notes. But regardless though, in regards to first chapter, this is a beat for beat retelling of the original game. All the story beats happen beat for beat like the original game, and if there's any changes made, it's relatively minor, like dialogue changes or moving a character from one location to another. And I would say most definitely this is a accurate retelling of the original game, recreating the game beat for beat like the original, which to be fair, it really doesn't make sense to change things here and there when you already have this large story arc. You don't have the same luxury as something like Final Fantasy VII, for example. Or hell, Dragon Quest VII Reimagined. So yeah, it makes sense to keep things one-to-one. Though the biggest glow up that we'll see is the presentation. Of course, we're moving away from the isometric silicon graphics look from the original game to 3D polygonal models with dynamic camera shots, and also some mocap scenes here and there that are well choreographed. And when it comes down to the quality of the presentation, like I said, you have your highs with the mocap and the choreographed scenes with the dynamic cameras, and then you have some scenes where you have characters just standing around with basic animations. As we know already, Falcom is relatively limited in their budget, so it does make sense to save some scenes where all the mocap comes in, the dynamic shots come in, and then with other scenes it makes sense to do the more standard people standing around with some basic movements here and there. I personally don't mind it all too much, as long as it looks presentable to me, it's fine. And then there's the voice acting, to which I would say is the biggest change alongside the presentation, particularly with the Japanese version. Though let's start with English first. Gunko has done their best to have multiple actors and actresses to reprise their roles from the previous game, whether it's Stephanie Shea as Estelle, Johnny Yon Bosch as Joshua, Michelle Ruff as Sherazard, so on and so forth. Though if the character was recast previously in an NIS release or an XSEED release, they do go out and have those actors come in to voice those characters. Characters like Matthew Mercer as Olivier or Vic Chow as Zin. Though that's not to say some characters were completely recast from the previous version to here. Characters like Josette and Gilbert, those characters were recast despite the fact the previous actors played them in previous releases. But overall, I think the English dub does things just fine from the bits and pieces I heard, because I played this game mostly in Japanese. And this is where the biggest changes come in, as almost every single cast member was recast to brand new voice actors, with the exception of 3 characters. Those being Takehito Koyasu as Olivier, Tetsuya Naba as Zin, and Eri Yamazaki as Lila, a maid that you meet in Bose. And aside from that, yeah, no one comes back. Everyone is basically recast with brand new actors and actresses, and overall I think the performances are fine. They do a good job of imitating the previous voice actors, or if they can't necessarily imitate what was there before, they do a good job of adding in their own spin to those said characters. Quite honestly, there's only really 2 characters I felt were a major downgrade from the previous voice. One of them definitely being Gilbert. Though aside from that, I think they do a good job. Though unlike the Evolution version, as I mentioned before, that version had multiple lines recorded, in the first chapter release, not so much dialogue was recorded like the Evolution version. Though that's not to say Falcom basically skimped on the voice acting, because there are portions of times where you explore around the world, Estelle and Joshua or characters you have with them will go on and quip here and there. And those lines of course are fully voiced. So don't come in expecting side quests to be fully voiced or certain cutscenes that don't really have much significance to be voiced, because you're not going to get it here. Though I do find it funny to where when a new character pops in and they're fully voiced, Estelle and Co are just full-on dialogue boxes, which is quite weird. But now we have the voice acting out the way, let's talk about graphics and music. As I mentioned before, the graphics have received a major glow up from the previous version, moving from the isometric view to full-on 3D models with fully 3D environments, And unlike previous Falcom releases, you can tell Falcom has done a little bit of cel shading with the graphical presentation. It definitely does wonders to give this game more of an identity. Kind of makes sense to have more of that cel shading look. And as for music, we have a mix between live orchestrated music alongside some MIDI compositions here and there. I would say for the most part, the brand new compositions are on par with the original version. They definitely do their best with the brand new tools they have to kind of match the style that the original game had. And at times, some of the newer renditions are definitely better than the previous versions, though there's never really once I felt a song was worse than the previous version of that song. Though for whatever reason, if you feel you do not like these brand new renditions, you can always switch back to the original OST or the Evolution OST. Though quite honestly, I wouldn't recommend going to the Evolution OST. But now we move on to the gameplay changes. And there's a lot to cover here because gone is the strictly turn-based style game with the grid-filled map, we now have a hybrid system of action RPG and turn-based RPG. Let's start with the action portion first. At first you're relatively limited with basic attacks and craft attacks, though over time you'll learn brand new abilities that will benefit you in the action portion, primarily combo attacks. And depending on the character that you choose, they definitely have a unique playstyle that complements them. If you don't find Estelle to be that fun to play as, or Joshua, you definitely have some good characters to mix and match with. Though of course, like I said, it's a hybrid system, there's also the turn-based portion. And before you ask, yes, you can completely ignore the action portion and play this completely turn-based. Though I will say you're definitely missing out on some things with the action portion, to which I'll explain later. In the turn-based portion, there's definitely some major quality of life changes made. You can actually move around while performing crafts at the same time. You can also do the same with performing arts. And when it comes down to the grid field, it's now a circular field, which has always been a thing since the Cold Steel games. And overall, it gives you a lot more flexibility of how you can control your characters, where you want them placed on the field, and when you want to avoid attacks while at the same time performing your own attacks. And also when you also do a critical hit, you can actually do a combo attack, whether it's a follow-up attack, a chain attack, or a burst attack. It's pretty similar to the Cold Steel games if you played those before, or hell, pretty similar to Persona. And initially at first, when it comes down to your burst attacks, you must have 4 party members to go on and initiate a burst attack, though down the line in Chapter 3, you do have the ability to do it with just Estelle and Joshua. And then there's support abilities. Whenever you level up or create your bonds between Estelle and Joshua or the other party members, they can learn brand new support abilities, whether it's helping revive people, giving them stat boost, or increasing their craft points. They're definitely relatively useful. Though at the same time, when I was playing through this, because I was kind of rushing through this game almost, I couldn't really tell when your support levels level up. And of course, S-crafts are here, and definitely for sure some characters had some upgrades with their S-crafts. Like Estelle and Charizard, they now have a little bit of an AoE attack with their S-craft attacks now. Olivier now has a much larger range when it comes out to his craft attack. And that's all the combat changes. Though we're not done yet, we have the level design, as towns, dungeons, smaller locations had their level designs maintained, just in full 3D. But when it comes down to traversing around the land of Libero, that's where you see some major design changes. As I guess it would be quite boring if we maintained those designs, because let's face it, when it came down to the original game, most of the level design was relatively flat, which kind of makes sense just based on the graphical style the original games had. But when you're doing this and making it into 3D, that design definitely wouldn't be that interesting. And now you have some areas where you can go up a hill, you can go down the hill, you can traverse around this spiral looking design to find extra loaded goodies. It does feel like Falcom did their best to make sure that Trails in the Sky first chapter felt a little bit more organic in its level design when traversing around the world in comparison to the original release. And the coolest thing about this is that these areas are much more interconnected. There's no loading screens in between. You can run around without seeing a single loading screen unless entering into a door or going to an area that requires a loading screen. And also Falcom added in these caves, where you can see a horde of monsters. You can do the action style or the turn-based style, and beating them all, obviously when you beat a crap ton of monsters, you get a lot of EXP. Definitely a great place to go in and grind. And then we have the cooking system, to which received a major upgrade. Unlike before where you just go out and learn the recipe, and then you can cook it at any time you want, this time around Falcom has added in this little mini game to where you can choose either Estelle or Joshua to cook the food, and depending on who you choose will determine whether or not you make a proficient recipe. And depending on the recipe itself, you can actually make a unique recipe. And as I mentioned before, cooking is relatively useful if you want to go on and make something without spending a lot of money on healing items and the such. And then we have the reward system, something that was introduced around the Cold Steel games and refined in the Daybreak games. This system here, depending on how many enemies you kill, how much recipes you cook, how many books you go on and collect, will give you extra little rewards. It could be something like costumes or brand new arts, extra little items like ceramic capsules, armor, and hell, even Sepid masks to go out and sell for gold. And yes, Sepid masks are a brand new type of Sepid in this game to where they don't really contain any kind of useful things to go out and create brand new ordnance on, but rather you can go out and exchange them for gold. This was introduced in the Cold Steel game, so definitely pretty nice for this feature to be added in retroactively into the Sky games. And you might already heard that I mentioned costumes. Yes, throughout the game you can actually unlock some costumes here and there. For all the party members from Estelle, Joshua, Sherazard, Chloe, Olivier, Tita, Agate, and Zin. You get one brand new costume for unlocking all their Orphanage slots, which is pretty nice, and it's pretty much Easter eggs to either Trails games or Falcom games throughout its history. And also you can get some costumes for both Estelle and Joshua by doing the reward system or just them giving you those set costumes. Or you can go on and shell money to Falcom and Gunko for DLC. As you can go on and buy a season pass to get unique costumes for all the cast members, and quite honestly, it definitely plays a lot on the fan service. Though throughout my adventure, I had Joshua dressed up as a chef because Joshua loves to cook and aspired to be a great chef around the world. Nothing about some destiny he has to go on and face, and yes, I'm not going to spoil that. But anyways, let's move on to the progression because definitely things are a lot more streamlined this time around, as the minimap gives you a lot of useful information of what to find in regards to side content. As I mentioned before, when it came down to hidden quests, you have to go on and find those yourself. Well, this time around, because of the minimap, they will indicate to you hidden quests that you can go on and take. And definitely for sure, it makes things a lot more convenient. And when it comes down to the Cornelia books, they'll give you blue indicators of letting you know where those locations are. And what makes this a lot more convenient is the fact that you can go out and quick travel throughout the world. And they definitely give you a lot of good locations to quick travel around. As for example, one of the quests in Zeiss is basically running around to different locations. Well, you don't actually need to do that. You can actually just quick travel to one place to the other, and it actually does count towards your goal. And another great quality of life improvement is they let you know that you're adding into your bracer points here and there. And yes, when you go out and perform a task correctly, right then and there they'll tell you how much bracer points you gained from doing the right task. So there's not a lot of guessing work to do until you go out and report your missions to the Bracer Guild. And with all these improvements, you might be wondering, is this still a guide game? And quite honestly, the answer is no. There's a lot more things to help you traverse around the world, and if you're playing to 100% this game blind, it's a lot more easier to do because of the indicators. And on top of that, fast traveling as well. So yeah, this is definitely not a guide game unless you really want to know and create a checkbox of everything you've done in the game so far. And so far you might be running, this sounds like a very much streamlined remake of the original games. Is there anything new that they added into these? And the answer is yes, as 6 brand new side quests were added into this game. 1 in Roland, 1 in Bose, 1 in Zeiss, and 3 in Gransel. And definitely when it comes down to some of these side quests, some of them are harmless when it comes down to it. It's kind of a little nice slice of life kind of thing going on here. Others give some fan service or some little allusions to the future. And in regards to Gransel, that location definitely needed brand new side quests, as originally you only really had 3 side quests in comparison to the plethora of side quests in previous locations. And with these 3 additional side quests, it definitely gives a little bit more edited things to do rather than just a tournament. And finally, once you go on and collect all the Cornelia books, originally when it came down to the secret weapon, you can either pick and choose between Estelle and Joshua, while this time around you don't need to pick and choose. You get both weapons right then and there, which is pretty nice. And finally, as I mentioned before when it came down to my impressions video, I did play through this game in Nightmare. And you might be wondering, with all these quality of life improvements, does it make this game a much easier experience? Yes and no. With the action combat hybrid system, It for sure makes grinding a lot easier because you can go on and do the action combat, stun them, and then switch into the turn-based mode, and then do a quick brave attack. So that's definitely easier. But some bosses are definitely quite tough, to where I had to restart a couple of times, because one thing that bosses now have are rage modes. I didn't mention it in my combat synopsis, because I wanted to save it here in the Nightmare run, because it's definitely very important in the Nightmare run, because when they go into a rage mode, they can go on and boost stats, especially speed, and don't be surprised when these bosses can go on and do a second turn right after their first. And definitely for sure, these guys definitely hit hard, so don't be surprised to where if they go into rage, and there's multiple enemies that can go into rage, that your party members are just dead right then and there. And you might be wondering how our other bosses will say. Well, that leads us into the spoiler section, and if you do not want to be spoiled, just get to this section right here. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you guys want to know how the Lawrence fight is, and quite honestly, he's just as hard as he was originally. Maybe in some cases a bit more harder, depending on the moves he does, but it's kind of hard to tell because this is a completely new gameplay style versus what we had previously. And once again, if you do die against him, you have to go on and restart that battle because it'll just progress and you lose your chance on those BP points. But still, regardless, like before, it's definitely a fun, challenging boss with ways to go on and beat good old Lawrence. And as for the final dungeon being the basement of the castle or the sealed land, once again, a relatively great looking dungeon. Falcom once again knows how to do their dungeons right. And the bosses were relatively similar to how they were previously. Kano was relatively on par with her previous incarnation, same thing with Richard. And as for the final boss, I had a little bit of trouble because, once again, Earthwall does the job just fine against this boss, but the problem I faced was the fact that I only put Earthwall on Estelle, my main hitter, so that definitely led to some problems here and there. Though I was still able to beat the boss with Estelle being my Earthwall mage. Though aside from that, everything kind of follows through as it did before. Pretty nice to see all the environments in 3D and some of the cutscenes now done in mocap here and there. It's pretty nice. And also once you beat the game and the credits roll, you actually do see Estelle and Joshua growing up when Cautious brings them in through a picture book, which I think is pretty nice. And once you beat the game, you have New Game Plus, which of course carries over all the things that you had from levels, arts, cooking recipes, and the such over to the New Game Plus, but also you can increase the enemies up by 50 levels. And there's also an achievement to get if you want to do the New Game Plus with 50 plus level enemies, Twitch potential livestream of course. And also you get some new costumes for both Estelle, Joshua, and Chloe. But other than that, I think it's time for us to wrap things up. I think the main question first is this the perfect game for those who've never played the Trails games in their life, and they're told to start with Trails in the Sky, but they don't want to start with an old game back in 2004? I say yes, with all the quality of life improvements and the brand new presentation, I think this is a much more approachable version of Trails in the Sky for new players. So that's definitely good and all, but what about me, as someone who's typically been known to be pretty critical on some remakes like Super Mario RPG or Dragon Quest III HD 2D Remake? How do I feel about Trails in the Sky First Chapter? Honestly, it's actually a pretty solid remake. It does everything that I would expect for a remake, recreates the original story beat for beat, while adding in some new contents here and there that wasn't there originally in the previous game, adds in all the quality of life improvements that later Trails games introduced later on, and also gives a good challenge with multiple difficulty options. As I mentioned before, with Super Mario RPG, I felt that game was a bit too easy when it came down to difficulty. And for Dragon Quest III HD 2D Remake, a game that promoted the fact that they were going to expand and flesh out certain things in that original game, for it to only be things about knowing where to go next, definitely left me a bit disappointed. And as for Trails in the Sky, it did exactly of what it was meant to do. Recreate the original game, bring in the quality of life improvements from the future Trails games, and introduce it to a brand new audience. And I can't be mad about that. It did exactly what I expected it to do, and the fact that the difficulty options in the game are fairly challenging, it definitely does hit the mark for me. Hence why anytime I'll probably go back to Trails in the Sky, which probably won't be for a while, I'm probably going to play both versions, both SC and First Chapter, as both games offer different reasons to be replayed. If you want the original experience, play the original 2004 release. If you want all the quality of life improvements or a pretty solid challenge, play First Chapter. there's no wrong answer here. And I'm definitely glad for Falcom that they've been on this winning streak of getting these games out in a timely manner, and plus getting new people into the series. But anyways, that's going to do it for today. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Plus, don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe as well. And of course, I make a bunch of videos on this channel, not just Trails, but also Dragon Quest, and hopefully other RPGs down in the future. So if you want to check those out, do check out these videos right here. I personally think you'll enjoy them. See you guys on the next one. Take care.